Analytics this morning. Do we have to take a roll call?
Robin, do we need to take a roll call?
Not to open the meeting, just for any votes for the minutes.
Great. Then welcome everyone. I think the only one who's missing presently is Dan. So we'll kick it off and hand it over to Civilytics for their presentation. I don't know, Vera, if you want to give.
Do you want to approve the minutes first
Do we want
for
to do
the
that?
agenda? Yeah.
Okay.
So moved.
Second.
Approval of the minutes, moved by Dorothy, second by Robin. Pardon me, second by Paul.
Good.
Paul can't second, he's the chair.
I can't.
Oh,
I'll
And he's
second.
a non-voting chair. Sorry.
I'm just here, but Robin is in charge. So Robin, carry on.
So do we have to take a roll call for the minutes?
Yes, please.
Approval of the minutes. Motion's been made and seconded. Dorothy Savarese.
Aye.
Sean,
Kristen O'Malley.
Aye.
Aye.
Lisa.
Aye.
Karen.
Karen, aye.
All right, minutes pass. Now we're ready for the presentation. Vera, did you want to
Sure.
talk about Civilytics a little bit?
sure, I will. I'm very delighted that we have our colleague here, Jared Knowles, who is the present CEO, Lord High Master of Civilytics, a consulting group that he founded. And that we engaged based on their experience, demonstrated experience in analyzing the ARPA funding options and being able to collate those. Yeah. Oh, Wendy's here.
Oh, hey, Wendy.
Let me pause for 1 second. Wendy has joined us also.
Excellent.
Jared Civilytics experience in the details associated with the ARPA funding options, as well as collating and cross-tabulating that information with other financing sources. And we have engaged his firm to for this committee express interest in doing just that for Barnstable County ARPA funds. Jared, are there any other introductory comments you would like to make regarding your firm or yourself?
I have a little bit about my history with ARPA just to help you all contextualize our remarks when I get started.
Okay. How would you like to proceed, Jared? Should I go ahead and share my screen and you'd like to go ahead?
Is it, do you want to share screen or can I share my screen and drive the slides?
Go ahead and share yours.
All right. And we'll just.
No, if
hope
you need. There we go.
How's that look for everyone?
Very good.
Great. So yeah, thanks. That was a warm introduction, and we are really excited to be working with Barnstable County and really excited about the work you're doing. I'll say more about that in a minute. So my agenda for this session is I'll briefly introduce myself and Civilytics to help you put the information we're going to provide for you into the right context. We're going to talk about all of the new resources that are being discussed that Barnstable County wants to think about how to leverage. We're going to zoom in specifically on ARPA and the infrastructure bill, sometimes called IIJA, sometimes called the bipartisan infrastructure law. Then we'll have time for some questions, and I'll also point out that our next presentation will focus more on state funding, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means and why that's important. But just to go a little more in depth on what we've done about ARPA at Civilytics. So we work with people, organizations, school districts, government officials like yourselves. We work with grassroots organizations, people, all kinds of people interested in having an impact on what their community does. When ARPA came out, I just did the quick math about how big the program was and realized that it was one of the largest semi-unrestricted funding flows to county and city governments in history. And that really put us to work on it right away. So we immediately tried to make available a list of funding estimates for communities across the country, particularly small towns. In the early days of ARPA, it was hard to figure out how much small towns were getting. And in that process, we realized that the Senate and the House versions of the bill were quite different, with one small part related to ARPA, which is how the money flows to small towns like some of the towns on the Cape. And that wound up moving $5 billion away from states like Massachusetts towards states like Maryland. So this is a mistake that we wished got more attention, but it didn't. But that sort of like got us really deeply involved in the formula and the funding mechanisms and the rules. And so we really started to advocate for more transparency, because getting information out about this to the public is really important to some of the goals of the program, which are to address challenges that communities are facing and to have public input. So we still maintain, I think, one of the best lists to find out how much money towns are getting, and people still use that. And we are pretty active in following the updated regulations that Treasury has. And so that, that sort of work has introduced us to groups like yours and others who are really thinking deeply about how to take advantage of this pretty large investment. And I want to just pause here and commend the commission's purpose and the convening of the commission, because there are some very easy sort of ways to spend ARPA money without getting a lot of public input or thinking strategically built into the law, to just say that the revenue loss happened and to put the money into the regular budget process and to funnel the money to business as usual activities through a budget process that doesn't think about the transformative uses that ARPA puts on the table. We see an example like St. Louis County did this. They basically took most of their ARPA money and just said it's for revenue loss, and we're not going to have a public discussion. We're not going to map this money onto our existing priorities or think about the opportunities that it presents. We're just going to spend it through our normal budget process. So that's not happening here, and I think it's a really a credit, because it's a lot of work. This process is a lot of work. And it's a lot of hard work about reaching out to communities, balancing priorities, in addition to doing your annual budget work. And so that is, I think, really important to keep in mind. And hopefully we can be helpful for you in making that work a little less difficult. The federal government isn't making it easy on you in a few ways. So one is that there's lots of different funding that has been passed, and some of it overlaps in what it can be used for, and the messaging around it is not necessarily crystal clear. So here's some examples of new and old federal funding streams that are sort of tangled up in the discussion about the types of activities ARPA funds are eligible for, and also when in the decisions about how ARPA money is allocated. So we have ARPA, but it contains multiple things. So ARPA doesn't just contain the money flowing to Barnstable County through the state and local fiscal recovery funds program. It also includes ESSER money, which is for the school systems within the county and has specific provisions related to that. It also contains the ERA for funding housing supports to people who are needing money for housing. It included direct aid to individuals and families. All kinds of programs are under the ARPA banner, and some of them overlap. We're going to mostly, when I talk about ARPA, the rest of this presentation, just I'll talk about the SLFRF funds, but if people have questions about other components of it, I'm happy to talk about that. So not too long after ARPA was passed, the infrastructure bill was passed. And ARPA included a lot of funding for broadband development, sewer and water systems, or those were big eligible uses promoted for the fiscal recovery funds. But the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act also includes a lot of additional money that's eligible and only can be used to work on sewer and water systems, drinking water systems, and broadband development. So that immediately we started to hear communities asking, should we spend our ARPA money on broadband, or should we wait for the infrastructure money to be spent on broadband? Should we spend our ARPA money on fixing our supply lines and upgrading our water system, or should we wait for the infrastructure bill to do that? We will talk about some ways you can think about answering that kind of question. In addition, ARPA references and uses some of the same program requirements and rules as the HUD Community Development Block Grant Program, which supports funding for public housing. There's also the Department of Transportation Bridge Repair Program, the Drinking Water and Clean Water Revolving Funds, which are administered by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection on behalf of and funded through the federal EPA. There's the broadband initiatives that were going on before ARPA as well, and that will be built now, and many more that we're working right now. And Vera has been very diligent in sending us information about the current federal sources that are being accessed by Barnstable County or have been considered in the past. And a lot of these federal investments will pass through state funding. The state is an intermediary, and we'll look at that in depth in a little bit. And then in our next presentation, we'll talk a lot more in depth about state programs and programs administered by the state and what that might mean. But I want to zoom out a little bit. So if we have all of these different opportunities to fund programs in Barnstable County, how do we judge which one we should use for what? So here's a few ways to think about the sort of uses and values of various different fund sources. So one is about thinking about this concept of push funding versus pull funding. So push funding is what's happening with the ARPA funds. The money is going to be deposited into a bank account for Barnstable County from the Treasury, and then it's up to the county to administer the money and report back to Treasury what happened. Pull funding is you write an application or you submit something to get the money brought in, usually for competitive grants, but sometimes also formula grants require monitoring when the funds are available and applying for them. We also want to talk about competitive versus formula grants. So competitive grants, you are going to write a grant application at Barnstable County, but Middlesex County might put together a few cities might put together a joint bid and bid against you for the same pot of money to compete. Formula funding says we're going to dole out the money based on some formula, usually based on the population or the need in communities, and communities don't have to compete against each other. They become automatically eligible. So ARPA funds are formula grant based on the population in your county, but a lot of the infrastructure bill money we talk about is competitive, that the county would have to put together a statement of need and a plan and apply and hope that the grant is given. So we want to balance those two things. We also have broad eligibility versus narrow eligibility. It may not feel like it always, but ARPA funds are fairly broad in what you can use them for. They have a wide range of acceptable uses and are much broader than, say, previous funding through the CARES Act was. And that's very different than the money set aside the infrastructure bill, which is narrow streams of funding that have very specific uses or policy goals tied to them. So that, in that case, if your goals and the federal government's program goals align, that's great. Then you can apply for the funding and use the funding. But if your goals don't align or you want to do something different, or more broadly useful funds, more flexible funds may be a better fit for that activity. There's the timeline for award and expenditure. We'll go into depth on this, but obviously you need to sync up when projects can happen with when the funding windows are open, when the funds would be awarded, when the project could be completed by. And that can get quite complicated when we're talking about large capital projects or ongoing projects. There's also cost sharing and matching requirements for some programs. So, the federal government might say there's $50 billion eligible for program X, but actually to access that funding, you might have to be willing to pay 25% of the program costs locally. That is not a requirement for ARPA, for example. You can, if it's eligible use, you don't have to, you can just use ARPA funds solely. But for some infrastructure programs, you may have to do some level of matching or put some stakes into the program yourselves. And then there's the distinction between ongoing funding versus one-time funding. This is it's kind of a blurry distinction because, for example, a lot of the infrastructure funding is listed as sort of one-time, but it funds programs continuously. There's continuous road construction projects that'll be funded through the infrastructure bill. ARPA funding is pretty clearly one-time. I don't think there's going to be an ARPA 2 that's going to send a similar amount of money Barnstable County's way. And so it is sort of important to think about, if we only have our one-time chance with this funding, it's limited use. We want to think about it in a different way than if there's continual supports that we're regularly accessing or we're regularly competing well for certain types of infrastructure spending that might be seen as more of an ongoing funding source. I saw that last time you got a really good description of ARPA. So I'm actually going to skip over this slide, but I put it in there for reference for everyone. And so again, when I'm talking about ARPA today, I'm going to be focusing on the state and local fiscal recovery funds. And here's the timeline for these. And I like to do this as a visual just to really emphasize what's going on. We're here in the second aid payments May 2022 portion. The funds must be obligated by December 2024. Obligated does not quite mean spent. It just means you have to say what they're going to be spent for and sort of commit that to Treasury, but they do have to be out of your bank account and expended by December 2026. So when I'm talking to communities across the country, I'm telling them that this is your zone of opportunity. You're getting the second aid payment very soon, and you have this window to decide how to best deploy those resources to meet the challenges in your community. And so this is great timing for your ARPA commission. And some groups are like, well, this is already the second aid payment. Are we falling behind? No, not at all. This is a great time to be making these decisions and having these conversations. So I think what really does trip things up was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And there's a lot of sort of discussion about it, but I think it helps to be really specific about what it is and what it does. So here I've laid out sort of the big picture pieces for it. So the funding is now starting to flow for the bill. The law's amount of spending depends a little bit on the future. So it's a 5-year authorization for the most part, and so we can't be 100% sure how much will be spent in years 4 and 5. So estimates range between 864 and 973 billion. But it's important to note that only 550 billion of that spending is above the baseline spending that would have been spent if the road and transportation bill was reauthorized without additional changes. So that's a lot of money, 550 billion. But over 5 years, the 110 billion, it's actually sort of proportionally across the country less than the amount of money that went out in the state and fiscal stabilization funds. So although you hear the headline that it's a $1 trillion bill and it's going to have all this new spending, it's important to break apart the rhetoric and look at what's really going to happen. So for a lot of programs that were already funded, people are saying that they expect to be about a 10% increase in the funds available for existing programs. So but then there's a lot of new programs that are created to do new things. And again, a lot of these are competitive programs. And we'll provide to you separately in written form a spreadsheet that has a breakdown that we've annotated from the National Association of Counties that's looking at all of the programs available through the bipartisan infrastructure law that counties could be eligible for and what the requirements are, whether they're formula funded or competitive, and what they are for. But I kind of aggregated it here by department. So you can see the bulk of the money in the bill is for the Department of Transportation for building roads and bridges and things like that. And the bulk of the new spending, $284 billion, is for that. So when we think of the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act or the bipartisan infrastructure law, it's a lot about roads and a lot about transit and a lot about transportation. The second biggest thing in terms of new spending is for the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy is going to have a lot of new programs related to energy efficiency and power generation. Then there's the Department of Commerce is third with a $65 billion new programs, $65 billion of new funding, $46 billion of new programs for broadband expansion. And a lot of the broadband expansion ideas and policies are very similar to the requirements that were previewed in ARPA. And now there's additional funding through the Department of Commerce and the FTC to help communities expand their broadband availability. Then we have new spending for water infrastructure and watershed protection. And then there's a $1 billion new program to improve state and local cybersecurity. So again, this is in the context of $40+ million of aid directly granted to Barnstable County through ARPA in the context of $350 billion in this fiscal stabilization fund to counties and cities across the country. So the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is really important. 5 years, a 5-year program, but it's very different than ARPA. And it's important to say that for most of there's going to be 3 ways the county will be able to access the infrastructure funds. For most of those programs, it would be competitively through grant programs. And how competitive those grants are, that's something to do a little investigation in, but it's a sort of a pull, not a push set of funding. There will also be some that will be suballocated based on population through state agencies. That's something we're going to look into for you and present in more detail to you at our next working group or at our next committee meeting. And there's some that are going to be given out through federal formula grants, which the county may receive some of the funding for. But by far, a lot of the funding is going to be through competitive grant applications. So just a little bit of a comparison for Barnstable County. Let's look at the ARPA SLFRF program compared to the infrastructure program. So Barnstable County is getting its $41.4 million over the 2 years. And the IIJA is an unknown amount that's going to come into Barnstable County. We're going to try to put some bounds on that through looking at the state flow throughs, but it's right now unknown how much money is going to be coming. The money has been pushed to Barnstable through a formula for ARPA. It's a mix for the IIJA. There's minimal requirements for ARPA. The IIJA programs are very narrowly tailored to specific program priorities and projects. And so they have specific requirements and specific needs. ARPA timeline is spent by December 2026. The IIJA programs, the allocation is going to happen sometime over 5 years, but it'll be up to individual programs to determine when the projects need to be completed by. Some of them could be longer term projects. There's no cost sharing or matching requirements for ARPA. The IIJA programs are funding dozens of federal programs with different blends of imposed federal and state program rules. So the specifics would really matter. And ARPA funding is one time, whereas IIJA programs would be a sort of blend between existing formulas and one-time funding for competitive projects. So I made a visual of this, which I hope summarizes it well to show the flow chart, because it's sort of a mess. And, yeah, so there's 3. I put ESSER in here because it is a considerable amount of money that went into the schools in the county, and I think it's important to keep the schools are one of the big things that happens in government, and so even if the county's not as involved, it's important to track the money that's flowing into the region. So you see that for SLFRF, there's sort of a direct path to Barnstable, direct path for the towns. Those are in green. There's going to be an unknown, but we're going to know it for you for our next meeting, amount of money that flows from the state's SLFRF money into Barnstable County and to the towns. We're working on narrowing that down because the state recently passed its legislation for what it's going to do with the $5.3 billion that the Commonwealth received. And then, of course, the towns are going to receive some money from Barnstable County, and they're going to ask for money from Barnstable County from the ARPA allocation to take on their projects. So that's the SLFRF. For ESSER, you see the state got some money, and the state's was required by formula to pass some of that money directly down to the towns. And the state also may make some competitive programs available that the town school systems could apply for from the state, but that's the state's still deciding some of that. For IIJA, it's a lot more question marks on this graph, and it's a lot more uncertain paths. So Barnstable County will definitely be able to request money from the state that the state receives through the programs funded by IIJA, and the state will suballocate some money to Barnstable County through existing pathways that it has funded that are funded by IIJA. But the details of that are still emerging. Barnstable will also be able to apply, and I put the three departments that have the largest amount of new programs. So these are brand new programs, not just new funding for existing programs, which is transportation, commerce, and energy. And they get 89 billion, 46 billion, and 60 billion. So Barnstable will become eligible to apply for funding from those to do things related to transportation, commerce, which is mostly, again, broadband funding, improving broadband access, and energy efficiency. And those paths would also somewhat be open to the towns. The towns will also be open to receiving money from the state through the pass-through. So it's a mix of for the infrastructure funding, it's a mix of needing to monitor what's happening at the state level closely and what's happening at the federal level to get a handle on the funding formulas. So the headline for this discussion today is that there's a lot of uncertainty about IIJA funding streams, though we know they're available. Right now, there's considerable creativity available to the county in using ARPA funds. So if we focus in on this money, I made a map to show this. So not just the workflow, not just the flow chart, but this is a little more in-depth map. And I'm gonna reveal it in phases to you so that we can embrace the complexity of the funding situation that Barnstable County finds it in together. So here I'm only focusing in this first slide on money that's directly flowing by formula to these entities. So this is money that is push money. And you'll see there's money from HUD for community development block grants that's pushed to municipalities. And then the big ones are the ESSER funds and the SLFRF funds that we've talked about, which push money both to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Barnstable County and the towns. And we know how much money that is. We've discussed that, right? So there's 41 million to Barnstable County, 26 million to the towns. The schools systems within the towns are getting 27.2 million. So those are known amounts. The money's moving. And I want to point out for HUD, there's a $311,000 grant to the town of Barnstable. That's the only HUD community development block grant that I'm aware of right now that flows from HUD into the Barnstable County region. There was also 6.4 million from ARPA directly to health organizations, not necessarily the county. 6.4 million to health organizations in the region that was allocated as well. You may know more about the specific entities that receive that than I do. But then I want to talk about there's a next set of funding, which is that the Commonwealth, which we'll talk about next time, is going to give some money to the counties and the towns from its ARPA allocation through a mix of grant programs, formulas, and competitive programs. So we're going to look into that and put some numbers onto these dashed line paths that are flowing back and forth from Barnstable County for next time. And the Mass DOT is going to be giving formula funding to Barnstable County or the region and regional planning for transportation projects in the county. The municipalities, as you're all aware of, are going to be requesting money from all of those entities through competitive grant programs as well, including requesting the money from Barnstable County. But they also have access to and will be able to request infrastructure spending on their own, and they'll be able to request spending money from the Commonwealth and for the Department of Education and from the infrastructure or the ARPA funds for the Commonwealth. But then we add IIJA and it gets really quite wild because I've just put the federal and state departments that we identified from the National Association of Counties spreadsheet as being programs that counties would be eligible for. But you can count up that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 agencies with arrows from Barnstable County between the state and federal government. And there's some overlap. Sometimes there'll be a lot of coordination between the state department and the federal department. And in other cases, the state may do things that are different or have different sources of funding in addition to what's coming from the federal government. In some cases, Barnstable is eligible to apply to the state agency. In other cases, it's eligible to apply to both the state and the federal agency. I want to assure you, if you look at this slide, that if there's an arrow, then I believe there's a program funded by IIJA that Barnstable County is eligible to request funding from that department. And we will put more detail together for you for that in the spreadsheet. Again, the same restrictions apply. You may not want to do the thing that the department is funding. It may not be important to you. The department may be requiring you to match funding or something that doesn't sync up with your local priorities, or you may be not competitive. You may apply and not receive funding depending on the program. So we'll put that that available to you in the spreadsheet. But the point of this chart is to emphasize the sort of complication and help you and see that the reason you felt the need to convene a commission and the reason you're having these conversations is very real, because this is a kind of a complex situation. It's not as if the infrastructure law was passed and it was very clear what infrastructure programs were going to happen and how counties could take the most use of them. That's not, it's a mix of that. But I want to try to help make it so we can have good Q&A now. And so I looked at your priorities identified very helpfully from the last session. I've maybe overly simplified the nouns associated with them, so feel free to make it more precise, but I've listed them here, that there's priority for water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, broadband access, public health programs, affordable housing and housing supply, early education and childcare, and business recovery in the county. So the question is, can ARPA funds build programs that other funding streams sustain and carry forward to continue to address these needs? And what needs can be addressed more urgently with ARPA funds compared to planned or for future funds? And so I've listed whether or not these activities and these priorities are going to be definitely eligible for these different fund sources. So I've put ARPA, I've put other ARPA funding, so not just the state and local fiscal recovery funds, the infrastructure bill, and then I just did a little peek. Of course, I wouldn't say that the White House statement about the fiscal year 23 federal budget is going to be law, but it is a somewhat noisy signal about what priorities might be in the future federal budget. And so I looked at that to see whether or not there are going to be programs proposed through that process that might cover some of these programs. So I highlighted in green affordable housing and housing supply and early education and childcare as programs that there's ARPA funding to address. There's definitely not infrastructure bill funding to address them. There may be some future federal budget funding to address them. So there is no additional money in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act to build public housing, to make housing affordable, to support existing affordable housing programs. And there's no money in that act for early education or early childcare. So if those are priorities, then the ARPA funds are the funds that could address those priorities that are available to the county now. The same is true for business recovery. Businesses didn't get money in the infrastructure bill. They did receive money in the ARPA. They are eligible for ARPA activities under SLFRF, and they did receive, if they competed and applied for, they were eligible for a lot of specific economic programs that were outside of SLFRF in ARPA, including notably the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP loan program. So next time we'll talk more about this part of the map that I made, which is the intricate relationship between the Commonwealth and the federal government as it relates to the Job Act and future funding streams, as well as the part about what the Commonwealth is going to do with its ARPA fund. But I want to actually leave this slide up and pause for questions now.
Great, thank you, Jared. We'll take questions from the committee. Anyone have any direct questions for Jared? Lisa.
Are there any indicators that the competitive grants for the infrastructure bill will mix counties with towns in the competitive process, or would they be separate process? Will there be a separate process for counties and a separate competitive process for towns?
That's a great question. I don't know it with definitiveness, but I know from the funding matrix that NACO put out, there were programs that it indicated that counties would not be solely eligible for competitive programs. So they would be competing against towns or cities or regional coalitions of or like a regional group potentially. So it certainly could be true on some programs that there is a path for competition just for counties and just for cities, not against each other. But for sure that NACO already has identified that for some programs, there won't be that.
Thank you.
Great. Dorothy?
Thanks, Paul. And Jared, this is a terrific analysis. Thank you very much. Really outstanding. And I note the footnote number 1 on this page about 6.4 million directly to public health entities. And, Karen has observed that there are other sources of funds that are flowing at this point in time. And I don't mean to preempt your question if you had it, but I didn't see your hand up. So I hope you don't mind, Karen. Jared, are you going to be mapping any of those dollars that are going to public health?
We can definitely do that. We can definitely look into that. We started our map sort of for the government of Barnstable County and then worked outward. So only things that are happening and going to the county, not thinking more broadly about all the eligible entities in the county. But that's something we can definitely look into, because we will be helping you think about, for our third meeting after we do the Commonwealth, we'll also look down sort of at the municipalities and what they're sort of already doing. And so we could add this public health spending, because I think that will be pretty helpful.
Thank you. Because as you look at the priorities and you think about sources of funds and ranking of priorities, I think it's helpful to us to have the context of what other sources of funds are available. And I had another question, but I'm going to be silent and let others ask questions.
Other questions? I have one question for you, Jared. Some of the things that we've been considering on a county level, we want to be unique to the county or set up infrastructure that might be able to use some of the other funding sources that come in over time. One of the ways we might do that, we've looked at sort of revolving loan funds, but there's an outstanding question as to whether that's an appropriate use of ARPA funds.
Yeah. I think it's a complicated one, and I think so the letter of the law says that you can use revolving loan funds, and the Treasury spells out kind of obtusely. They say that the loans can be given and have a maturity longer than the period of spending, longer than December 31, 2026. But then you have to do some careful accounting for how much of the loan you count as coming out of your ARPA funds. I think it depends, I guess. This is something I haven't looked fully in depth in, although I did look at it because I saw it on the agenda. I looked into it a little more in depth this morning and read the final rule language again. So I think that it is definitely possible, but I do think that it would need to be a very different type of loan program, one in which you may be willing to assume the chance that you may need to forgive the loans at some point or some portion of the loans in order to, so not to think about, I wouldn't think about the revolving loan fund as a revenue generation that's sort of sustaining and ongoing. There may be a portion of it that you can, but it certainly wouldn't be the case that if you loaned out $10 million, that you should expect that the return on that $10 million would be sort of be able to be sustained under the program rules, as a very broad way of answering that question. But some portion of it, I think you could expect to be continuing through the revolving loan fund.
Great, thank you. Karen.
Great, thanks. Great presentation, Jared. Thank you for that. Just a quick follow-up to Dorothy's comment and question, the AARP funding for community or for public health, it just strikes me as a little bit low based on what I know of, and was wondering about the source documents for that. And then similarly, if there is that direct funding coming to community health, which I happen to know about, what are those other direct streams? Are there other ones that are outside of the state and local fiscal recovery funding?
Yes, great question. So the 6.4 million figure is it's a sub program, so similar to SLFRF, but it was for community public health reasons. And there was a formula funding that went to community. We'll look more into the specifics for you for sure. But you're right that there's a lot of other public health money available in ARPA that public health organizations could have gotten. Plus the CARES Act, which preceded ARPA, was mostly about public health money. And so a lot of, I didn't go back and look at the CARES Act specifically, but those organizations certainly received a large influx of funds under the CARES Act as well. And also if the community health organization happens to be run or in partnership with a municipality, it could be the case the municipality chose to use some of its CARES Act or ARPA funds to also support that. So there are other streams available, but I will say the infrastructure bill has no more new money for public health. The fiscal year 23 federal budget says that it's going to do a lot about public health, but that's just the Biden administration's proposal. And so, again, it's going to be listed there, but it's a question of what would that program ultimately look like and what order of magnitude of spending are we actually looking at there.
Great, thanks, Jared. Just as a follow-up to that, is there any indication of public health funding that's available? What the split, how much is going to be allocated toward public health services and how much might be available to improve public health facilities?
Yeah, when you say might be available, are you talking about for the federal budget upcoming or from the money that was spent on ARPA?
Of all the money that's out there, because we've got public health requests and concerns that have come in are sort of in these two categories. One is services, additional services we can provide, but some are upgrades to facilities. And so I wonder if there's like a capital aspect to the public health funding that's available or might be.
I don't want to say too much because this is not an area that we looked a lot in depth at already, but I know that in the CARES Act, there was sort of both types of funding made available and pushed out, right, to update facilities to make them more resilient to airborne viruses, for example. There was funding specifically to sort of support that. And then there was funding to improve public health services or do more public outreach and improve the capacity of the system to communicate. I will, when we look at the public health funding that came through ARPA that's flowing into the county, we'll look at that specifically for you and see what the program requirements were there. And also when we do that, we'll try to look at what has already been spent, if that's available publicly, and help report back to you about what's already maybe been allocated for those purposes in those two categories.
Thank you, Jared. That'd be very helpful. Sean.
Right. Thank you for that presentation. And just from the broadband perspective, I think your characterization of the ARPA, what we call the SLRFR funds, and the IIJ were spot on, because there's a great deal of flexibility in terms of the Treasury rules as to how that money can be spent and the eligible uses and so forth. One thing I would say, though, on the IIJ, the infrastructure bill money, as it relates to broadband. So on the slide that's up now, it says yes for broadband, and that's true. There's $65 billion in there for broadband, $42 billion for network deployment. But there's a sort of caveat with that, which is that the requirements in that bill. So historically, the federal government, the way they define unserved versus underserved has to do strictly with speeds availability in certain areas. And so in the infrastructure bill, for example, it says that the broadband money has to first be spent on unserved areas, which are areas that don't have access to broadband of speeds of 25.3. Now, I won't go into the weeds on what that stuff means, other than to say that there's really no places in the country that don't have access to 25.3 except in rural areas. In other words, the broadband money in the infrastructure bill is really sort of geared towards rural areas, and only after a state certifies that all 25 that you've taken care of the unserved, meaning people that don't have access to 25.3, then can you spend the money on what they call the underserved, which has to do with speeds of up to 120. Meaning, like, so for our area, there really aren't any places on the Cape where you don't have access to 25.3 broadband. And so the caveat with that money in the infrastructure bill, there's some goose eggs in there for broadband money and how you can address affordability. But as it relates to the ARPA funds, they don't strictly define unserved and underserved strictly in terms of speeds. They allow you for local communities and regions to take into account affordability and reliability. And of course, here on the Cape, as in most places in the country, but particularly here on the Cape and across the state, you've got this monopoly situation. And I can tell you that Comcast and Verizon Fios, they're not coming across the bridge with fiber, which is what everybody's after. Fiber to the home. That's the gold standard. That's the future-proof stuff. That's what those are the new networks that are being built. The grant money that's being doled out. Really, the federal government has put their thumb on the scale in favor of fiber build-outs. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as some sort of like additional sort of context in terms of the broadband money. And so when people ask that question as it relates to broadband of should we be using ARPA funds or should we be waiting on IIJA, we at ILSR and folks in the community broadband space say it's the rescue plan funds where you're going to get your biggest bang for the buck and when you have the most flexibility.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I think there is the smaller amount in the IIJA, but you probably know this better than I do about the middle mile program, which I think is a smaller program, not the 45 billion.
Right. And we are, and that's really for middle mile networks, and there's a robust middle mile network that already exists, Open Cape on the Cape. And so on the Cape, the real issue is the last mile network, which is the sort of the fiber to the home piece of what Falmouth is proposing to do and is moving along. But to build out that network is going to cost about $55 million alone. The build out on the Cape, back of the envelope calculations, it probably costs about 250, 300 million bucks to build out fiber to the home across the Cape. But as it relates to just the buckets of funding, it's the rescue plan funds as it relates to broadband where you have the most flexibility, so that while there is a substantial amount of money for broadband in the infrastructure bill, there's limits. Now, NTIA is going to come out with the rules probably sometime in May as to the specifics about how that money can be spent, but they have to still obviously hew to the parameters that Congress laid out in that bill, which has some specificities in terms of how that money can be spent. And on top of that, Massachusetts frankly has an embarrassing broadband plan. They've got paltry sums that are being proposed in relation to various other states around us. And we don't really have a state broadband office. And even to access it, in order to get the money from the federal government for those broadband funds, you have to have a 5-year plan that lays out in detail how you're going to spend that money. And the state is nowhere close to that. And so it's going to be a while before the state gets that money at least for broadband in the infrastructure bill.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Great input. Dan.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, Sean, because I'm a little confused. Comcast made the ridiculous statement that there are only 50 homes on the Cape that don't have access to, and my whole neighborhood doesn't have access. And instead of looking at this from the top down, I sort of look at it from the bottom up. If you identify the number of homes on the Cape that don't have access and where they are and who the people living in those homes, it seems to me that the challenge here is last mile. And I guess I'm confused as to, are you saying that last mile is not eligible for funds? Because I actually think
it is in the infrastructure bill. It is, but it has to be spent first on what the infrastructure bill defines as unserved areas before you can spend it on underserved areas. And of course, Comcast are going to make those claims. And of course, the FCC maps are notoriously inaccurate in terms of who has actual access to broadband. Local communities have a much better sense. School districts know, oh my goodness, we had 1,000 kids that couldn't do distance learning because they don't have broadband, or, so the FCC maps, they're trying to get better data. We don't have a lot of hope that it's going to get much better. Various states are, have different mapping efforts underway to get a better sense, because the way the FCC mapping stuff works is it allows the ISPs to self-report and to claim, for example, if one home in a particular census tract theoretically can get service from, say, a Comcast, that whole census tract is counted as being served. So that's the reason why the FCC maps are so inaccurate, because they broadly overcount who has access to broadband. But as it relates to the infrastructure bill, yes, there's money in there that can be spent on last mile networks. It's just that the way they define unserved and underserved really, it's really geared towards, let's get this money first to the rural areas, and where there's more densely populated areas, cities, and places where there's no competition, but you can claim that, hey, you guys have Comcast, so you're fine. Those areas are meant to be backburnered, which I'm sure, the big telecom lobby, spent a lot of money lobbying Congress on this, and oftentimes, and now the fights are at state houses, and so those groups, tend to only hear from lawmakers, fund out in the rural areas, in the Berkshires and everything, because we're never going there, because there's just not enough money to be made. But don't dare do anything to accidentally create competition by, for example, making money available to municipalities to build municipal broadband networks, because we don't want to get our clocks clean by them building fiber to the home networks while we've got this outdated technology, and people realize that they're paying $150 a month for second-rate service and unreliable connectivity.
Thanks, Joe. Dorothy?
You're on mute.
Oh, so sorry. Okay, we had to do that at least once today to make everybody feel comfortable. No, and Sean, we're so lucky to have you as part of this committee with your in-depth understanding of this, and certainly, your information is being confirmed. In a related thing, I guess what I was wondering, just because there was a comment that one of you made as you were having this conversation. So, and part of this is I'm stating the obvious. So between the FRF of 26 million to the towns, and then the 27.2 that is the ESSER money, but it comes through the state. And so, Jared, that is not part of the state delineation that you're going to be working on for the next time. That's actually formulaic, and it's coming through. So that the municipalities are currently getting 53 million. The county is getting 41.4. So I note in footnote number 2 that, and when I read this before the meeting, I didn't know what EC meant. It's saying ESSER 3 funds to school systems in the county may support some EC efforts. So number 1, the question was, what's EC? Number 2, I heard somebody, and Paul, it might have been you, say, is there a possibility of using some of the ESSER dollars for broadband expansion to support the schools? And is that a backdoor way of supporting some of the broadband expansion on the Cape? Probably not. Again, Sean, you have the technical knowledge to know, but so it's really, in terms of that ESSER money, what is the flexibility relative to the utilization of that?
Well, I think I'm pretty sure Sean knows more about the broadband part of the ESSER money than me, but EC means early childhood, which is a bit of jargon. A lot of our work is in the K-12 space, so some of my K-12 jargon slipped through, but that would be referring to the early education and early childhood education and childcare. Some of that could be supported by ESSER funds administered through a school district. So that's what that refers to. I would imagine that providing technology or subsidizing students' ability to access learning remotely, like probably subsidizing broadband subscription, would be something that could be done under ESSER, but I'm not sure whether or not it would be like sort of what Sean's talking about, of like helping build out some sort of a municipal network. Could be, but I doubt the school systems would do it on their own. They probably want the municipality to work into it. I don't know, but Sean maybe can speak if there's been any conversations like that specifically as well.
Yeah, actually, it's a good question that I won't pretend to really have a good answer for, other than that, certainly there's funds that can be used for things that don't have to do with deploying networks, but that are also part of accessing, distance learning, devices, digital literacy, put it, maybe even building like what they call like these gap networks, like these CBRS networks that some schools have built, or some places like Tucson have built, where it's like a wireless network for low income students and so forth. But in terms of connectivity at home without an actual broadband network, you're talking about gap networks or hotspots and devices and things like that, which can be a substitute, but they're not. It's not really a solution to the connectivity challenges. So I'll just say that. And I'm not aware of any school system that has built their own network. At least there's examples of schools working with towns in terms of building out certain connections, but not a town-wide network.
Thank you.
Thanks for that information, Sean.
Beth had her hand up a while ago. I'm not sure.
Beth.
She,
Can't see her.
That's okay. My question really had to do with kind of an overlay idea. I was looking at slide 8, where you did the zone of opportunity for ARPA. And it, what's the zone of opportunity? I know it's 5 years of funding for the infrastructure. Is there, can we look at that kind of similarly? Because knowing that a lot of those grants are going to apparently going to be competitive, we'd have to, we want to make sure we have enough information. I think it's going to impact the decision making. And it goes to what Sean was talking about, some of the nuances of the funding and the flexibility. So I was just wondering if there was a zone of opportunity kind of slide for the infrastructure money, or is that too complicated?
I don't think it's too complicated, but I didn't do it yet. But
Okay.
I think it would look something like you're going to start applying for these grants Q3 of this year, maybe for some of these programs. The grants would open up. This is ballpark, but then you would imagine that whatever it takes 6 months at least for the money to come back if you win a grant. So then you're looking at some money maybe starting to come in the second quarter of 2023. And that sort of will build up as more programs come online and become accessible. Programs that go through the state, are going to be delayed a little bit probably while the state figures out how it's going to administer it.
Right.
So, I think it's you just basically take this zone, but start dragging the zone over a little bit to the right. So it starts more around the end of this year and continues probably, peaks sometime in 2025 and then starts to begin to taper off, or something new has taken place since then. I'm more than happy to make a visual of that for our next meeting.
No, that's helpful. No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions from the group today? If not, I want to thank you, Jared, especially for your earlier comments about the ambiguity and unclear nature of the distributions to the IIJ, because we were at a meeting a couple weeks ago with Senator Markey. You may have heard we have a couple of bridges here that need to be replaced. And the explanation was, well, it's like 9 billion here and 3 billion there and 4, but we don't know where it's going to come from, but we feel lucky. So if you can find out how they're going to fund the bridges, that would be helpful.
It's the old saying, it's better to be lucky than good, but I think you need to be good and lucky maybe to be sure that you're going to get those bridges built.
Yeah, I mean, the state's made a strong commitment to it, already appropriating $380 million to work on the approaches on both sides, and has something in front of the legislature now for a $3.5 billion bond, so that they can start spending and then reimbursing from federal funds as it become available. But it still seems a little bit unclear. But thank you for the presentation today. It was really informative, and I think it helps guide our discussion around our regional priorities. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I will send there will be a written report that will encapsulate the information from the slides and the presentation as well, that the committee's asked for. And so you'll get I'll probably send you a draft of that, which covers the federal stuff in between. And then as we do the state stuff, we'll add to it. And at the end, you'll have a report with everything as well. So if anything wasn't clear, wants to be clarified, you can let us know. And we'll make sure that gets into the final report. So thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this process. I again commend the committee for being really thoughtful and strategic with this opportunity to improve the whole community. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for working with us in a back and forth way. So if we have comments, we'll send them along, and you're free to hang out for the rest of the meeting if you like. But we are going to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is a discussion about revolving funds and ARPA eligibility from Vera.
Share my screen 1 second. I'm in trouble because I'm running this meeting from here as well as I wanted to pull something up. It's just some draft language. Well, not draft language, but it's the language from the final rule, pages 366 through 368, in which the final rule treats the issue of how loans shall be administered and dealt with. And so this will be a slightly underwhelming part of the agenda. I don't have much more to discuss beyond what the final rule says. And Jared actually did a good job summarizing that earlier in his talk. We are waiting for we're hoping that our consultants, the accounting consultants for our ARPA portal would be able to join us today to talk and answer your questions on this subject. But they are all of them are actually at a conference this weekend, so they weren't able to attend. So with your permission, if we could defer this particular agenda item to
Sure.
the next time.
Right.
I don't have much to add at this time.
Okay, that sounds good. It's really,
Sorry.
it's an important discussion. So,
Yeah.
you know, we can have the consultants, if they can make it in 2 weeks, I think that would be really useful, because it sounds like there are sort of two aspects to the revolving
Mhm.
loan. One is the expenditure. So if it's out of your bank account, that's probably counts as the expenditure. But the second is how you use it. Has to be used through the fund in a way that's consistent with
Yeah.
it. So like if we were gonna add 5 million to the septic
Mhm.
loan program, we could probably do it if we subsidized, completely gave part of it as grants to,
Yeah, there's a third consideration. What if during the allocation period, funds start coming back, you have to reallocate. So there's, and then if they start coming back after the 2026, how do we account for those?
Yeah. So, realize that we may be in a situation where the ARPA legislation says, sure, you can put them in a revolving loan fund, but the accounting of that is gonna be
Right.
so burdensome, no one's
Yes.
ever gonna do it.
Right, I think we're much better served by our accountants addressing this than your public health person, so.
Ideally, the revolving fund, the first money that went out would be that money. And then we could stop with that because the new money coming in isn't considered that money. And I don't know if they allow you to do that. But it's
Yeah,
really
they can.
priming the pump, the water's at primes the pump, it's not sitting there always. It's out and gone, and then the water coming back in is new water. I don't know if you're allowed to do that.
Yeah, we'll see,
see.
yeah.
Okay.
Or money to a loan forgiveness program. That's
Same thing.
associated with, so in 2 weeks, we're gonna have that discussion.
Jared has his hand up in my
Jared
head.
Jared has his hand up.
They thought of that. So the payment of the principal back to the fund is considered still the ARPA funds. The interest or any profit that you make on the loan entity is considered revenue that you can do whatever you want with. But unfortunately, they did specifically say if you pay back the principal, it is still considered has to be governed by the rules of the fund. Although it's very unclear what happens if someone pays the principal back in 2028, or you grant them a loan till 2040 and they pay it back then. I don't know about that one. And I won't say my opinion on it. I'll let you all think about that on your own.
So our consulting accountants for ARPA will advise us on this.
Great. So,
Sorry, I can't be more fulsome in this right now.
no, thank you. Thank you. So we're going to move on to number 5 on the agenda, which is a discussion about the ranking of regional challenges, which builds on the discussion that we had 2 weeks ago, but identifying and looking at the acceptable categories for funding under ARPA. Public health, disproportionately impacted communities, negative economic development impacts, infrastructure, and then admin, premium pay, and government services. So we are going to have to address that aspect of it, especially as it relates to sort of the last 3 categories. Admin and government services. I don't foresee that being necessarily purview of this committee, but we have had a couple of requests in on the premium pay side. So I do think we're going to have to decide whether that's something that's appropriate for the committee to consider. It certainly seems somewhat difficult or discretionary. So I think.
We'll say in the ordinance that was passed by our Board of Commissioners in the Assembly, they ruled out investments for the towns in premium pay and in revenue replacement. So, but it remains an open question for the regional funds.
Right. So I think the first thing that we're going to have to do is narrow the categories, the funding categories that we're going to consider. Some of them I don't think are going to meet the requirements. But when you look at public health, disproportionately impacted communities, negative economic impacts, and infrastructure, and match them up with the regional challenges that we talked about and identified at the first meeting: housing, water quality, childcare, economic development, infrastructure, and climate change. They all sort of nest within those federal funding priorities.
Yeah.
So I think the process for this committee, because it becomes very complicated, but it would be easier for us, I think, to prioritize the regional challenges because we have a lot of data in on them up front. So, looking for some consensus from the committee as to whether that would be the best way to approach prioritizing regional challenges and nesting them within the categories of appropriate funding issue areas under ARPA. No. Yeah.
Nobody else. I mean, so I look at this as first of all, crisis, not challenge. And second of all, it crosses social and human need with economic crisis, because I'm hearing from more and more businesses on the Cape that they are either not going to open or they're going to have limited hours because they can't find housing for their workers. So, I mean, to me, the housing issue on all fronts, I think second homeowners who have unlimited funds, they're doing okay. But anybody else, if they want to live here year round or want to be part of the seasonal economy, really are having a problem right now. So I rank housing right up there.
Yeah. Any other discussions about issue areas?
Would you like me to put Jared's slide back up?
That would be helpful.
I think I'll do that.
And Vera, is there a way that you can share that so that we're having a teeny bit of trouble following what's happening right now on the virtual thing?
Do my utmost. Trying to get to this summary slide of Jared's here. Dorothy, can you see that?
Yes, and we have copies of that. What I think, again, wasn't clear, what I heard Paul do was articulate the funding categories that are eligible under ARPA, and then the priorities that we've identified, and then asked for a prioritization, understanding some of those are nested in there. I guess where I was not clear is which is the superior list, which is the nested list. Do you know what I mean? So can you just give us some clarity about what the ask is, Paul?
Yeah, and I think we want to start with the federal funding priorities of the ARPA legislation. and I think that our regional challenges and the programs that we're likely to see that address those regional challenges are nested within those 4 federal funding components: public health, disproportionately impacted communities, negative economic impacts, and infrastructure. So I think we can put it all together that way. I think that it would be easier for this committee to focus on the regional priorities part of it as we prioritize, because what we want to do is we want to sort of stay focused on the outcomes, which we discussed at the last meeting too, which are we are going to make recommendations to the commissioners. We are going to prioritize regional issue areas and challenges for them in their consideration, and then provide criteria for evaluation of projects.
Okay, and that makes perfect sense. And again, you verbally read the regional priorities that we established last time. What I was actually asking if those could be shared on the screen so that we could be looking at those together as we're having a discussion, that in terms of their fitting into the buckets, if this that's on the screen didn't include all of the ones that you read. So again, and maybe it just cut out because the microphone cut out a couple of times when you were talking. Are these the regional priorities that we are to be suggesting to be prioritized?
Yeah, the regional priorities that I listed are the ones that we discussed at the last meeting, the ones that Christine.
No, I get that they're the ones that you discussed. What I'm asking is what's on the screen the same thing that you just read?
No.
That's what I thought. So what I'm asking is, could you, just for purposes of process, would you mind flashing up on the screen what you just read verbally, the regional priorities that were established last time, so that everybody's looking at the same thing?
Yeah, I guess I didn't sort of preface the point here. I think we're still sort of in a process discussion. So I would envision this committee is going to spend a whole meeting discussing the prioritization of regional priorities. It's not something we're going to be able to get through today. And there does have to be a diagrammatic sort of presentation for us to consider that. My question was whether prioritizing the regional priorities is the best way to approach our initial evaluation as we consider the recommendations we have to make to the commissioners. Wendy.
So I think that there needs to be an overlay of time. Time is going to be our enemy in this case. So if we know housing, and I don't disagree with Dan's statement, housing is like the priority. How far can we move the needle in the time that we have to spend this money? And if we decide that we can't move it far enough with a particular housing initiative, maybe we go down to the next priority, which could be, I'm not going to pick any of my favorite children at the moment, but I do think it would be good to have a sense of how shovel ready we are. Just thinking. Yeah.
So I think the initial, some prioritization and discussion about the regional challenges will be good. But there are a couple of sort of process points. One is, I think it's within the purview of this committee to report back to the commissioners in an iterative process. So if we make some initial determinations up front, I think we could report back. So if we were to say that a certain amount of the money should be used for a small business, for a small grants program, you know, that could serve a bunch of people on the Cape, that might be something we could send to the commissioners initially, get some money on the street. And then consider the regional priorities as we move forward. And from that, we've got to look at these cross-cutting issues that should be evaluated with every project, and specific criteria. And I think what we're going to have is we've got 52 sort of recommendations that have come in from the process to date that are very specific. And I don't think that we're going to see that many of them are of the size and scope that we had anticipated, given the money that we have to look at. So I'm just trying to get us focused on the process and what we're going to do, what our outcomes are going to be, and how we're going to make some of these decisions going forward. These discussions are going to be complicated. And I think especially on the regional issues and looking at some of the projects that have come in and knowing that we want to do things that are of a larger and more transformational scope, we're going to need more studies, right? So another initial feedback to the commissioners might be, for example, out of discussion today, we need X number of dollars for a broadband study because the information we're getting from the FCC about some of this stuff isn't accurate, and we'd like to work with local school districts and municipalities to get a more accurate number of homes that aren't served, for example. So, you know, and so we could potentially fence off some of the money for discussion, but we need some of those questions answered up front. I think we're going to run into the same issue on freshwater, water quality issues, and housing. So part of our discussion would be to prioritize these big priorities, but then to determine, based on some of our initial rankings and criteria, what additional information do we need to make more specific recommendations back to the commissioners. So if we can do it in an iterative way, we may, for example, recommend to the commissioners that they put $1 million out on the street in a small grant program. We may not, I mean, that might be administratively complex too. But another recommendation would be maybe that we take a look at the water quality studies that have been scoped, the broadband studies that have been scoped, and the housing studies that have been scoped. So and they've all been scoped. We're gonna run through the commission, but they need to be funded. And I think we're gonna need some of that information, feedback, to make final decisions on some of these larger sort of program initiatives. So, Wendy.
So my question is, what if we can't spend the money fast enough? What happens?
Goes back.
We lose it. So I think that's part of the consideration would be, you know, one of the criteria is we're not going to do a project that we can't do within the time we have to spend the money. So that becomes one of the criteria for evaluation. Lisa.
And I think one of the considerations of how much time and money do we spend doing more studies? And I do think, you know, there's a very small appetite outside of county government and, you know, I just honestly, you know, the study after study after study that, you know, just delays the action.
Right.
And so I just say that just sort of outside, that's number one. And then just as we think about the prioritization, like with anything else, you know, having this agreed upon elements of how we make a decision as a group, you know, the scope, the severity of the problem, the magnitude of the potential impact, you know, just having that kind of, we agree, this is how we look at each of these issues, how they cross cut with the ARPA priorities. As you look at public health as an ARPA priority, and it cross cuts all of our priorities in big ways. I mean, really big ways. You know, I don't know how the other three in different ways, right? But I don't know. So there's a part for me that like having an agreed upon way in which we go through this process as a group.
Great point. And I think that's what we're trying to get at today. But what's the process that we're going to use? And I think we are going to have a diagrammatic sort of discussion about the issues out there. But you raise a point that I think is important for consideration by the committee, which is if the first thing we do is recommend to the commissioners that they spend money on studies, there'll be criticism. So if we are recommending that we spend some of the money also to put it on the street initially through a small grants program, that might balance that a little bit. But I think the broadband discussion is a good one. I mean, it will be difficult without better information to recommend that we spend a lot of money in that area. I think housing also, it's going to be difficult because we don't have enough money we don't have 250 million to build up the last mile. You know, we don't have $1 trillion to solve the housing problem. But what we can do is we can facilitate sustainable programs going forward that can attract additional money and make a difference. But we're gonna need more information to do it.
No, I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'd like to put the word study to bed and use the word roadmap, and any roadmap needs to have an action plan.
Okay.
We have the commission with all their information on housing. We have HAC. We have all of the towns that have information on housing. What I would like to do is present a roadmap. We don't have the resources to build all these things. But wouldn't it be neat to actually have someone tie all of the studies, information together and then say, here is the potential, build 2,000 units here, or, here is town by town. So I'd like to see us talk about roadmaps that have action plans
Yeah.
attached to them.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think health, I mean, if we include mental health, because one of the things I'm intellectually trying to do is tie COVID to the issues that are specifically related. Housing is, health is, mental health certainly is. And then say, okay, we're gonna have a roadmap on any of these issues and then prioritize them. Obviously not today, because we've got like 6 minutes left.
right.
But I mean, that's what I'd like to see. So instead of what's the most solvable problem that we're gonna put money to, what's the most achievable roadmap we're gonna create to solve the problem? That $41 million is not gonna solve these problems, not a single one of them.
Nor will the overlay of all these other funding sources necessarily, right? But being able to have a roadmap that plots these funding potential opportunities beyond ARPA.
Well, I don't know if those other sources are actually helpful to this process or whether they're sensitive complicators to what we're
I
trying to
think
do.
both.
And Jared, I really appreciate what you brought to the table, but I look at what this group was actually brought together to do. And it confuses the hell out of me now when I look at all these other funding sources. So it's great to have it in the room with us, but I'm just not sure we can take all that on. I mean,
Yeah.
Maybe some other people.
Yes, Dorothy.
Well, the good news is that Lisa articulated one of the points I wanted to make, which is, and this is what I was trying to ask you, Paul, what's the process you're asking us to go through in terms of prioritization? And so I think the issue of criteria is critical, and magnitude and impact. And then Dan brought up the other point, which is, we can't sit here and pretend that these 8 people are going to be able to say, this is exactly how the money should be spent. But I think this understanding, I think what Jared is bringing to the table, and to a degree, just a tiny bit of disagreement with you, Dan, which is, if we understand that there is a significant amount of money, let's just pretend that what Sean said instead of what he said is that there's going to be oodles of money for our underserved area in terms of broadband. We could actually move that down in terms of priority. What he helped us understand is, nope, that there's not. But in terms of the roadmap, I guess the other question is, how can these limited dollars, and they are extremely limited, be able to be injected in a way that provides sustainable change? And I think that's because we could spend this all tomorrow, or do exactly what Jared said, the one thing do, just put it in the budget and it's spent and there you go, or give it to a couple of things that would give the money away quick like a bunny, but not make sustainable change. So I think the thoughtfulness about that roadmap of the prioritization, the criteria, and then identifying the fact that, and here is the question I have. It sounds like there's pressure to report out in a very quick fashion for concrete things, but in some of these cases, a little bit more information is going to be needed. So what is the tolerance for getting some answers so that we could formulate a recommendation that's more precise? Those were my points.
Okay. Well said, well said. And the word study does sort of make the hair on your back of everyone's neck stand up a little bit. But given, I have seen some of the scopes of the work that need to be done, and we probably shouldn't call them studies. I mean, if we look at a roadmap on housing,
Yeah.
we know that there are answers we need as we sort of move forward with that program. So maybe the output is the housing study, but we can frame some of the issues that need to be answered there. Water quality is similar in nature. And I have some thoughts on how we might sort of step through this and some diagrammatic information. I didn't feel it was within my purview to sort of just suggest that today. So I thought we would have a more a discussion about what kind of process we wanted to use moving forward. But I'll send out what I have for the committee's feedback on how we can sort of discuss these things. So it'll be a list based on the minutes from the previous meetings. It'll be a list of outcomes that I think we agree on, a list that we've started to collect around criteria, if there's going to be an evaluation of specific projects, and then the alignment of the federal spending categories with the regional challenges. And so with those three that are will be easy to read and look at, we can study that a little bit and then come again back in 2 weeks with a process by which we can start to evaluate. Because my instinct says that we are going to, if we were to prioritize just the regional challenges, we would then need to segment, to have meetings that were just dedicated to housing and water quality, broadband and public health. So that we can get a little bit, as much of the detailed information, the information that we need, that we have up front, because we're not going to know what the gaps in information are until we have that kind of presentation and step through it. So I think the biggest difficulty for this group is there's pressure to get some recommendations back soon and to activate this money in a way that's going to provide a regional benefit. But we do have this zone of opportunity that Jared has discussed, and we don't want to be premature in just chunking out a bunch of them up.
Can I ask Beth a question?
Yeah, sure.
Beth, can I ask you a question? Relative to all of the funding sources that Jared put up there, which really are helpful, are you at the county level looking at that also in addition to this 41 million? Because I don't want to overstep our charge. I mean, we were asked by the county to do a very specific thing, and that was to look at the ARPA money. We weren't asked to go back to them with a comprehensive budget suggestion relative to integrating in all of these other funding sources. But the county should be doing that. So I guess we want to make sure we're not either duplicating or doing something or overstepping.
Right. So my response would be, there are bits and pieces of it being done and we're collecting that information. Part of bringing Jared on was to really do that kind of more systems mapping, so that, in one of you said it really elegantly earlier, it's so that we're not going to be tapping into ARPA funds if we know that we can be using some of the infrastructure dollars. And I think the broadband example is a perfect example, because there are the nuances that, yeah, it looks and sounds great at a high level, but once you get into it a little bit more, it's not really going to work for our region. So I don't know if that answers your question, Dan. The charge is really around ARPA, but it's hard to make those recommendations around ARPA without knowing the bigger picture, which is why we brought on Jared.
Just to be iterative with you though, Beth,
Yeah.
that's perfect, because you're at the table here, as we go through the issues, then the county needs to be prepared to say, yes, there are other sources.
Yes. And
I'm not sure we as a committee should be doing that. I mean, that's sort of the role of the county at the table.
Right.
So I think, Paul, to that point, I love your idea of, taking the issues and starting to do meetings on those, because then the county can come in and say, yeah, but there's state money in this bucket, there's other federal money in this bucket.
Right.
And either we sync up with them or we don't duplicate what they're doing in these other buckets. And broadband is a.
No, it is an example, and it's part of our charge is that there are already requests into the county that overprescribe the available funds. And so that they want from us some recommendations on how to vet, because they're gonna have to say no to some of these things. And there may be things that could be done regionally that no individual organization is gonna come forward with a specific plan, because it's just too big. Right. So it has been complicated. We are at 12:30. Jared's going to make another presentation on the state side when we meet again in 2 weeks. I will send out those 3 sort of diagrammatic pieces of information for your consideration. The final sort of question, what I'd like some feedback on, is we could start at the next meeting to review in depth some of these 6 identified regional challenge areas. If that's what the committee would like to do, we'll dive in substantively. We'll take, I would say, 2 at each meeting, because I'm not sure we're gonna get through more than that. And then we can hold until after those presentations to make any sort of final determinations about recommendations to the commissioners. But I do think, I just wanted to note that I don't think there's anything that would preclude us from making iterative recommendations as they come up.
Yeah.
Dorothy?
And just a point of clarification. When we say there's applications that have oversubscribed the dollars, there actually wasn't a formal application process. And so I mean,
No
I
application.
get that there were requests for dollars, but I think it, you know, again, I know that maybe this is wordsmithing on my part, Beth, but you know, there aren't applications. There was not an application process, right?
You are absolutely correct. There has not been an application process. We did a public comment period where, and even before and after the public comment period, we've gotten a lot of written requests for, you know, we have a need, we'd like to use ARPA funds for this. In fact, we had a group come before the commissioners and the assembly yesterday with, you know, letting them know about their needs. So, I mean, the reality is we're not going to be able to meet all of the needs. There's just no way. So I think going back to that criteria piece for evaluating and decision-making, the scope, the magnitude, the potential impact, and something I said meeting one is really the sustainability in the transformational aspect of it. I think it would be, I think it would be good to talk a little bit more about if we could release a segment and designate a portion of it for things that we know are important right now, getting into the summer season around the negative economic impact bucket, and get started with some of that. But I don't, that's just me, you know, that's my opinion. So. But because some of these other issues are so big, like around water and around housing, that those are going to be the two that really we have to, you know, as Paul said, dig into a little bit more, hear about what's already been proposed, and then using that criteria, you know, scope, magnitude, sustainability, et cetera, do our best to say, yeah, this would be the best use of ARPA funds for this particular area.
Yes, well said, Ben. And if I said applications, I apologize for misleading people. But there's definitely been input through the public comment process that gives an indication of the kind of applications I think we would see if the portal is open. Lisa?
It also strikes me that we could actually take the priorities from 6 to probably 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, public health is one of the cross-cutting ARPA strategies, right? So we can reduce from 6 to 3 or 4 and then start looking at them with the cross-cutting strategies. And I think what we're talking about, Dan, with the road mapping versus studies or is creating a window into what the zone of opportunities is for each of these priorities. Because that's really what I think the job is. There's this zone of opportunity with these funds around some critical issues in the county. And it sounds to me like that's in the end kind of what we could provide in our guidance.
Yeah. So we'll get into that in 2 weeks. We'll send the information out. Even the process piece of this is going to prove to be difficult at times, because we could take the regional challenges and cut them down from 6 to 3 in a prioritization process. But if the portal is going to open for applications just in a general sense, it might be that we would take applications in and part of the scoring process to see which regional challenges they attach to. So that's going to be part of the discussion. And I apologize for the confusion. Are there any sort of statements by any members of the committee before we think about adjourning? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion for adjournment. Second. Wendy? Excellent. We'll have to take a roll call for the motion to adjourn. Dan?
Yeah,
Lisa,
Aye.
Dorothy,
Aye.
Kristen.
Did you not? I said aye.
We got you.
Aye.
Deb.
Sean,
Aye.
Wendy,
Aye.
Karen.
Hi.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank
All right,
you.
again, thank you very much. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
I was curious.
Bye.
Somebody needs to share that.
There wasn't a roll call.
Oh, I thought I missed it.